here today with Mary Kole. She is a senior literary manager at Movable Type, and she is also the mastermind behind kidlit.com. So where she gives tons of amazing advice to writers of children's literature and YA on her blog on a regular basis. It's fantastic. Let's just dive right in.
Absolutely.
When did you first fall in love with children's literature?
My favorite memories growing up have always been centered around reading. I grew up actually in Russia. I'm Russian. English is not my first language. And I grew up in a crowded Moscow apartment with more books than space for them. And before I could read, my mom taught me Pushkin poems, and I was reciting poetry and all of that. My best and fondest memories from childhood on have revolved around books, around reading. So it's always been a passion of mine.
Was there any book in particular? Like, was there that first love that you had with
my
a book?
favorite book growing up that I've read in 3 languages, in Russian and then in the original French and in English, is The Little Prince. I think people writing for a children's audience feel more responsibility toward their readers, toward their audience, to distill the world, to say something big about the world. And so I feel like those books are always more thematically rich, and they have kind of a bigger thing to say and to contribute. The book came as an extension of some work that I was already doing for Writer's Digest. Writer's Digest Books and F&W Media are publishing the book, and they said, hey, you have great numbers for your webinars, you clearly have an audience out there, put together a proposal. And I took the challenge of writing all new material for the book. Mm-hmm. It's not a reprint of blog stuff, because I wanted to reach the audience, to give them something like, this is it. After I say this, maybe I won't have anything more to say. I wanted to kind of get it out there in a very concrete, kind of concentrated form. But I also wanted to challenge myself.
Do you have one tip that stands out, one technique, just a little teaser of what we could find in the book?
Voice is one of those things that is very difficult to develop. And one of the big faults that I see, or not faults, but opportunities for growth, let's call them, in a lot of manuscripts, is that the voice seems old or it seems stiff. And in children's books, you have to be as fluid as possible. One thing that I absolutely tell people to avoid, if possible, I know that we have the maxim of write what you know, but I see a lot of manuscripts where they're set in the era that the writer was growing up. And usually, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s and 90s are considered historical in the children's book market. Everybody go cry about it, but it's true. It seems incredibly dated, especially when you look at just how the world has changed in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And there's just no reason for that. Modern or a little bit future settings work so much better. And the same goes with voice. And just because you're writing historical, if you do make the choice to write historical, doesn't mean that you can get away with dry voice.
What makes it so that you can't resist a manuscript? What's the one thing?
I would say it's 2 things, actually. And the irresistible thing that I'm using for the book, it actually comes from this quote from Ursula Nordstrom, legendary children's book editor in the 1950s. She published Goodnight Moon, she published Runaway Bunny, and all of Charlotte's Web. And in one of her letters, she wrote, "If I can resist a book, I resist it." Now, that sounds a bit grim and demoralizing. Well, if people are just going to be resisting my book, why even bother? But that's the challenge. You have to write an irresistible one. And at least in Slush, these days, premise is really important. And when I talk about premise, that means your book idea. So when I'm reading Slush, I have to pay attention to how, this is a dreaded term, but how high concept the story is, and also how the author is able to conceptualize their story and pitch it in the query letter. Because if it's a story that seems to have too many tendrils, or it seems very quiet, like a girl growing up on a farm in Vermont gets her first boyfriend and learns about love and friendship, Something about that book is going to have to work super duper hard for it to stand out. I look at how clearly you express your idea. That says to me that you have a very strong story core, because if you can't pitch me your story in one sentence or in one paragraph, taking it to 350 pages isn't going to fix it. But then I also look for, when I get to the actual writing sample, because I do consider both, I take a query and a sample. If you start in action, if you start with an event, sometimes it's a voice, but very rarely am I just grabbed by an irresistible voice if it's talking about sitting around your room and thinking about how much your life sucks. But if you start in action, if you start in scene, if you start dynamically with things happening, it becomes that much harder for me to walk away from the book, because you plunge us right in. You can do too much of that, like if you have this character being chased by an unseen monster and they're like, where am I, who am I, what's going on? Those are questions you do need to answer for your reader, because your reader opens a book thinking, who is this, where are they, what is going on? But you start with action. That's my biggest grabber tip. And so I'm very, very excited about middle grade right now. And what it is basically books that are shorter than YA for a younger audience. I would say 35,000 words for a manuscript, maybe 60 if you're writing genre like science fiction or fantasy. And you're really going for 9 to 12-year-olds. Now, some of your readers might be younger there, because that age group especially likes to read up. They want to know what the older kids, the more sophisticated kids are doing. And characters are usually 13 and under. And I would say that's a pretty hard rule, because when you start getting into 14, 15, that's really on the cusp between middle school and high school. And if you think about high school, kids are driving, kids are sneaking out, it's two different worlds, I would say. Now, where people really stumble in middle grade is voice. Again, it all keeps coming back to voice.
And do you want to talk a little bit about that distinction, category to genre, and why children's literature and YA and middle grade are not genres per se?
Of course. When we talk about genre, we usually mean realistic contemporary or horror or romance or sci-fi fantasy. But when we talk about category, that's it. Age group is shelved differently. So for example, a category would be, if you go into your local independent bookstore, you see the fiction, the nonfiction, the travel, the cookbook. It's very much the same in children's, because you see the picture books are a category. You see independent readers. Well, independent readers in middle grade sometimes is interchanged, but you see that chapter bookshelf I was talking about earlier. And then you see middle grade / independent readers, sometimes it's called, and then young adult.
What do you think readers could learn from reading this category? So in this case, middle grade, like what could someone who writes romance or thrillers or what have you learn from middle grade?
That's a great question. I think that because of our ever-shrinking attention spans, there's a lot of pressure to plot well, to have tension on every page if you do it right, to raise stakes, and really get your characters through the paces of an exciting plot as early as possible, as often as possible, to button chapters very well and really keep the reader engaged, because kids, especially kids today, you're competing for their attention. Sometimes you feel like a dancing monkey, maybe, or you're jumping through hoops, but every time you have a white space on your page, they could put the book down and go play Xbox or go text their friends or any other number of stereotypes about teenagers. And so I feel like if you pick up one of the really successful middle grade or YA novels, like the Percy Jackson series, I keep saying that, but it's really actually well done, you will get kind of a masterclass in pacing and in really keeping your reader engaged with a lot of action. I think that's important across the board for any writer. Holes by Louis Sachar.
Oh, I love that book.
I love it. here I'm going to do a stupid shameless plug for my book because I kind of based it on the Writing the Breakout Novel by Donald Moss model, which is very excerpt heavy. And I excerpted 35 books and analyzed them. That was really fun for me. It was like writing the nerdiest, best book report ever. And I'm a nerd, can you tell? And so the books that I picked for that are good recommendations. I'm awful, if you'd believe it, at book recommendations on the spot. On my website, though, I have a resources page that lists by category my favorite books. So I would direct you there. MFA programs are not for everyone, but one thing that they do, I've noticed, is they give you a rigorous environment in which you have to finish, and you're paying however many $1,000s. There are some that will pay you. I don't live in that universe. I had to pay for my MFA to finish a manuscript, to get good at critique, and it's that kind of that climate of being critical, not criticizing, but thinking about what you're reading critically, thinking about the work of others critically. That will eventually filter down to your work. It's never going to be as easy to analyze your own work as it is the work of others.
Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank
you.
This
was so great to meet you.
This was great.
This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, and wonderful work.
Thank you.